știm noi din vremuri strămoșești, cuvânt de dor și luptă, de doine și povești. Dar dacă astăzi pacea e lege și scut, e pentru că pe lume partidul s-a născut. Spre țară pe drum știut, e pentru că pe lume partidul s-a născut. E pentru că pe lume partidul s-a câte dulci cuvinte le-am moștenit în grai, doar bănuiam ce-nseamnă ce tâlcuri au sub strai. Dar dacă astăzi tâlcul de plin am priceput, e pentru că pe lume partidul s-a născut. самых до окраин, южный гор до северных морей. Человек проходит, как хозяин необъятной родины своей. Тут жизнь невольна и широка, точно Волга полная течет. Молодым везде у нас дорога, старикам везде у нас почет. Никто у нас не лишний, по заслугам каждый награжден. Золотыми буквами мы пишем всенародный сталинский закон. Этих слов величие и славу никакие годы не сотрут. Человек всегда имеет право на учение, подвиг и на труд. Над страной весенний ветер веет, каждым днем все радостнее жить. И никто на свете не умеет лучше нас смеяться и любить. Но сурово брови мы насупим, если враг захочет нас сломать. Как небесную родину мы любим, бережем, как ласковую мать.
Марш левый, 2, 3, марш левый, 2, 3, заряди, товарищ, нам. Ты войдешь в наш единый рабочий фронт, потому что рабочий ты сам. И так как все мы люди, то должны мы, извините, что-то есть. Хотят накормить нас пустой болтовней, чертям спасибо за честь. Марш левый, 2, 3, марш левый, 2, 3, заряди, товарищ, нам. Ты войдешь в наш единый рабочий фронт, потому что рабочий ты сам. И так как ты рабочий, то не жди, что нам поможет другой. Себе мы свободу добудем вдвоем, своей рабочей рукой. Марш левый, 2, 3, марш левый, 2, 3, заряди, товарищ, нам. Ты войдешь в наш единый рабочий фронт, потому что рабочий ты сам. In der Arbeiter Einheitsfront, weil du auch ein Arbeiter bist. Ты войдешь в наш единый рабочий фронт, потому что рабочий ты сам. Reitet ein in der Arbeiter Einheitsfront, weil du
утреннего стяг в жизни важен первый шаг. Слышишь, веют над страною ветры яростных атак. И вновь продолжает собой, и сердцу тревожно в груди. И Ленин такой молодой, и юный октябрь впереди. И Ленин такой молодой, и юный октябрь впереди. Весь летит во все концы, вы поверьте нам, отцы. Будут новые победы, станут новые бойцы. Милости не жди, жизнь для правды не щади. Нам, ребята, в этой жизни только с правдой по пути. И он продолжает собой, и сердце тревожно в груди. И Ленин такой молодой, и юный октябрь впереди.
Greetings, everybody, and welcome along. It is the evening of the 16th of August, 2025, and here we are with our reaction stream to the Putin-Trump summit in Alaska, which has obviously concluded by now, concluded yesterday, and we are going to be talking about like what happened and what the general verdict is. And the general verdict is that by just about everybody, including New York Times, Washington Post, and CNN, and of course the British reactionaries, those that write in and read the Daily Telegraph, are all almost in complete agreement that the winner of the summit was President Putin, and that it certainly wasn't Donald Trump. Now, it is worth reminding ourselves of what was actually sought from this meeting by the US side. What has been sought by the US side for quite some time now has been, certainly since the arrival of Trump, has been a ceasefire to freeze the conflict on the current lines of contact that is going to be non-conditional. In other words, that the Kiev regime just has to stop firing and the conflict freezes, and then some kind of peace negotiation can be had. The Russians have refused that thus far, up to this point of the summit, and they continued to refuse it in the summit yesterday. In fact, it became pretty clear from the rather curtailed nature of the summit that the Russian delegation, which included Putin, Lavrov, Ushakov, and Dmitriev, went in there and said the position is this, which is that they outlined the position that Putin first outlined to the world in June of 2024 at the speech he gave at the Russian Foreign Ministry, which is that the Russians require the four regions that voted to join the Russian Federation to actually be recognized as Russian territory, including all of Donetsk, some of which the Ukrainians are still holding on in, but of course it becomes increasingly difficult for them to do so given the assaults we've seen over the past few days and weeks. And that also that the question of NATO is removed from the Ukrainian political considerations, not just for 1 or 2 years, but for several years. And that this is something which is written into the existence of Ukraine, meaning it's going to be neutral territory, not a member of NATO in perpetuity. And this is something that was obviously expressed to Trump and his delegation of half-wits yesterday. And who knows, maybe they finally started to listen. I wouldn't bet on it, though. So, big things to take away. First of all, the summit was curtailed. It was meant to last longer than it did. In the end, they had a 2-hour discussion followed by a brief lunch, then everybody fucked off. Because that says to me that the Russians went in, made their position clear. Trump realized, or some of Trump's handlers realized, that there was really nothing more they could say because the Russians didn't make any real concessions, and therefore Trump and co had to fly back and consider what to do next. There was no assassination. It was never never on the cards. There was no arrest of Putin. Trump tried some cheap intimidation tactics by flying some functional F-35s and a B-2 bomber overhead. But seeing as how the Russians have systems in place that can easily counter all of those things, I don't think that Putin would have been particularly intimidated by any of that. So there's no assassination. There was no capitulation. Putin wasn't replaced by a cyborg or anything like that, though that seems to be what the Daily Mail in Britain was claiming. They just went over there and made their demands. And does this mean there's going to be some kind of agreement? No, not in the immediate period ahead. What is happening is that there is now consternation on the NATO side, which is that they are desperately trying to work out exactly what it is that they're going to do next. The ultras, the British, etc., the most aggressive factions inside the United States will be trying to work out a way of avoiding any kind of deal and just spinning the war out as long as they possibly can. That's clearly what Zelensky's employed to do. It's clearly what he intends to do. So the question is, given that apparently Putin and the Russian delegation went into this meeting and said to the US side that they wanted all of Donetsk, they've got all of Luhansk already. They were prepared to settle for the division of Zaporozhye and Kherson as they are now, and of course then the guarantee that Ukraine will never join NATO. And the question of EU membership is left somewhat unclear after this, but the previously stated Russian position that they didn't want Ukraine joining the EU either, as the EU is now regarded as a hostile foreign bloc. So it's most likely the case that the Russians would object to EU membership, given the attitude of the EU, which of course is the attitude really of the German ruling class, as expressed by Merz and prior to him Scholz. So the question then is, if it is going to be the case that the Trump administration finds this acceptable, given that they fear the war is too costly and too difficult to continue for the American side, as has been well documented. They don't have the military material required to continue supplying the Ukrainian side at the same rate. The Ukraine is running out of men, already running out of material. The Europeans and the British don't have the necessary arms manufacturing capacity to supply Ukraine to continue the war at the current, I think the military term is burn rate. So the question is, does the NATO side go for this deal, which is, a small territorial exchange to give Russians control over all of Donetsk, maybe some withdrawal of Russian forces from up around the Kharkov area, and then the changes to the Ukrainian constitution, the dropping of the anti-Russian measures, the anti-Russian language measures, the dropping of the Bandera worship, etc. Is that something that can be agreed to, particularly the NATO thing? Well, there are some who believe that can be done. I would say that the answer is largely no, not by Zelensky or anybody else who is very much tied into the current Ukrainian regime. Like, Zelensky is fundamentally a puppet, principally a puppet of London and a puppet of Washington, I would say secondarily, but principally a puppet of London. Can he agree to any of this? Because the theory going into this that many express, and I express some belief in this myself, which is that the aim of the US side, God knows whatever Trump might say, but the aim of the US side in terms of the US permanent bureaucracy is that they want to freeze the conflict, to retool Ukraine to have another go in a few years' time. The question is, will Ukraine be capable of doing this? That's the question that has to be asked. Will the Ukrainian regime, if it agreed to these peace terms, which the Russians aren't going to shift on, this is like in terms of land, this is the minimum the Russians can ask for, which is the current contact line plus the rest of Donetsk. Zelensky has already ruled that out. Others in Washington seem to be thinking that maybe this would be acceptable. Because if you look at it from the point of view of like the Trump administration, particularly Trump himself or J.D. Vance, they can spin this as a victory. Trump can go out there and say, I created peace when that useless, demented asshole, Joe Biden, was only going to create more war. Who wants war? I want war sometimes. Sometimes I don't. I don't even know. But he can claim it's this huge victory. I stopped the war. The Russians didn't take all of Ukraine. Ukraine survives thanks to Donald Trump. And then the Americans can move on to what they really want to do, which is depending upon which day of the week it is, renew the war on Iran. Trump essentially admitted to that in his interview with Sean Hannity, or continue to try and stage some sort of provocation against the Chinese. But I find the prospect of open war between the Chinese and the Americans to be very unlikely, given how bad it would go for the American side. Never rule anything out, though. So, what is is there a chance that the Zelensky regime could agree to these terms? I would say at the moment, no. I mean, this is why the summit was cut short, because there's clearly nothing more to discuss. Trump has to go, or somebody representing Trump has to go to Europe and talk to these like hyperventilating naked emperors and see if they can be talked round into agreeing not just to the settlement of the direct war in Ukraine, but the wider point that Putin was asking for in the meeting with Trump, which is to sign essentially up to a common European security framework, where essentially the Europeans would agree not to attack the Russians and the Russians would agree not to attack the Europeans. Now, Putin can, of course, sign such an agreement because he and any Russian leader has no intention of invading Eastern Europe. They have no intention of invading Poland or anywhere like that. They don't even really have any intention of assaulting those yapping chihuahuas in the Baltic states. So they can sign such an agreement, no problem. The question is, can the Europeans sign it? My argument is no, they can't. And they can't because the French and the Germans, together with the British, really do require the defeat of Russia somehow and the collapse of the Putin-led system somehow. And if it can't be in Ukraine, then they will try and make it the case that it is somewhere else. Bear in mind, I mean, why is it that the British have a 100-year-long defense agreement with Ukraine and similar things being signed, though not quite as melodramatic, with like Poland? It's because that there are those in the British ruling class who see Poland as the next big fat target to essentially throw at the Russians, or should we say the big fat provocation to throw at the Russians. That's the way that the British see their arrangements with Poland. Stage a provocation, see if the Russians will go for it in Poland. Maybe stage a provocation on the border with Belarus. That kind of thing. There'll be those in the British permanent state that see that as an attractive alternative if Ukraine can't be used anymore. There will be those in France and Germany who see it in similar terms. Quite if the Poles fancy doing this job, that's another question. But my instinct, looking at like the demands that the Russians were making about NATO membership, that ruling it out completely for Ukraine, and also let's not forget agreeing to a common European security framework, which is apparently what the Russians were after, is also something that the Europeans can't agree to and won't agree to. I don't think they'll even agree to permanently rule out NATO membership for Ukraine. I think they can't afford to rule that out. So what we'll get is, this is the opening gambit, as I said the other day, of a back and forth that will carry on whilst, and again, Putin has made this clear, the war will continue. The war will continue, particularly in Donetsk, because if they can make the military reality on the ground match up with their demands, then it leaves the Americans and the Europeans and the British with not very many places to go. And but the plan on their side, or at least the most coherent plan from the most aggressive elements, will be to somehow continue the war and force the Russians to keep fighting. The Russians, I would argue, would expect that, though. And if that is the case, that it becomes clear that Zelensky is never going to agree to stop the war, then they will have to force the issue and actually collapse the Kiev regime by inflicting a gigantic military defeat on it. Does raise the question of if the Kiev regime agrees to some version of this, say if the Russians advance to the point where they are on the borders of the Donetsk People's Republic, and then they're going to take the whole thing. Does the Kiev regime then, in a desperate bid to save itself, get forced into an agreement, which can then be presented as some sort of great victory? In my opinion, some would want to go for that. the problem for the Kiev regime is that that if that's agreed to, the forces that bind the Kiev regime together will start to fly apart. It's only the war which is keeping all of these different factions together in Kiev, or many of which despise each other. But with the war removed, and especially if the war is removed at the cost of incredibly high casualties, and for a deal which essentially gives the Russians largely what they were looking for. So they were never really after conquering huge areas of Ukraine. It's not something that they were interested in doing. They've taken Zaporozhye and Kherson, or part of those oblasts, because that was where their line of contact was. And they were, after the setback in September of 2022, they were obliged to make up for lost ground by absorbing these territories. But they don't really want to go much further, because bear in mind what we talked about the other day about the Russian war aims and the Russian tactics. The British, the French, the Germans, and the US wanted the Russians to go further. They want them to fly to Kiev or all the way to Lvov. And they want the Kiev regime, if that collapses, that's good, because in their minds, then they can bog the Russians down in an insurgency. That might have worked very well in 2022. It will work less well now with a very war-weary Ukrainian population who are just desperate to get out of this thing. Many of them will be anyway. But the fact is that as the Zelensky regime is just a wholly owned subsidiary of the imperialists, it's going to be very hard for him to agree to anything without ending up with the bullet in his head. So the likelihood is that the Russians will continue their warfare. They'll continue to advance through Donetsk up to the point where they reach the border region, and then they will probably make an offer again of ending the war on that basis. Will the Kiev regime accept? Again, the closer this gets to being a reality, the more the pressure on the Kiev regime grows. But the more the individuals within it will know very well that if the war ends, then the likelihood is their their kleptocratic reign will come to an end. And maybe some angry Ukrainian mobs will seek vengeance on them. So you have, like in Kiev, a regime which cannot agree to compromises because its very existence, in some cases physical existence, is tied to the continuation of the war. And you have a bunch of European states, particularly France, Germany, and Britain, who would love to continue this indefinitely if they could. The question then comes up about capabilities, and the capability of them to continue arming and funding Ukraine is actually shrinking every day. So the Russian thinking, in my view, is that if they get this deal, then the question of the future of Ukraine will get brought up again very soon anyway, because the Kiev regime will become very unstable. It would take an enormous amount of resources, which the European countries now are not going to have, to rebuild, retool, rearm the Kiev regime and get it ready for round two. If the US isn't interested in this, and if the US is more interested in trying to take out Iran or trying to stage a provocation with the Chinese, the Iran side of this is much more likely, then they're not going to have the military and financial resources necessary to do a rebuild job on the Kiev regime. The Europeans won't be able to do it either. That and any money they put into the Kiev regime will disappear out the back door anyway into somebody's bank account. So the Russian thinking is that they have time on their side. They don't need to make vast land acquisitions. They observe that the Kiev regime is very unstable, is likely to fall to pieces, and then they will be able to probably either take more land when the Kiev regime falls apart, or wait for a better disposition of forces inside Kiev that would actually come about, that will elect or appoint some kind of government that will at least be neutral when the nationalists, the fake nationalists, the pro-NATO gang are so completely discredited that a different kind of Ukrainian state might emerge. Either way, what's going to be left there is a basket case which will not be able to threaten the Russians, even with assistance from NATO. And it's going to be interesting to see if the Russians maintain their position of no NATO, no foreign forces, no military assistance, shrunken military. Well, again, like those aren't things that the Kiev regime can agree to. So the Russians have come out ahead on this diplomatic encounter because Putin went over there, looked very serious, as he always does, was in charge of his facts, made his case directly to Trump, and Trump basically got the air let out of his tires, and now he has to go away and thinking about what the hell he's going to do, because having the in-person summit made no difference. The Russians made the same demands, and now Putin is talking about bringing Trump over to Moscow. I doubt that will happen, to be honest. I'm prepared to be proved wrong about that. I think Trump will get back to Washington to an array of headlines proclaiming that he's a loser and Putin beat him completely, and that if in order to keep pressure on Putin, it's now necessary to go all in and back Ukraine again. But what is most likely to happen here from here on in is a slow Russian conquest of the rest of Donetsk, followed by the Russians making a demand, basically, that the war end on that basis. The Kiev regime will be pushed further and further towards collapse, and either it capitulates when the Russians take the rest of Donetsk, or it collapses. And the British line will be, forget Keir Starmer, the British line will be decided by officials in the intelligence services and the Ministry of Defense, will be to try and just keep the Kiev regime alive somehow to make the war as costly and bloody as possible. So either it ends with the Russians militarily taking control of all the areas they want to at this stage, or what happens is the Kiev regime in the end has to be knocked down, and that will be how we can tell if the British have got their way. If the British get their way, it will mean that the Russians have to go much further and actually knock over the Kiev regime itself, which would mean actually going and taking Kiev. The Russians don't want to do that because they think that they can get what they need without having to go there. So therefore, the European side and the British and the most aggressive elements in the United States will be desperate to do just that, which means no peace anytime soon, barring some kind of change of disposition of forces inside the Kiev regime, or if somehow Trump and his administration get half a clue and decide that they want to end the war, even if just temporarily, and so therefore they would have to change the balance of forces in Kiev themselves, meaning the removal of Zelensky. Though who you're going to bring in to replace him is another question entirely, given that there's almost nobody else. Well, there are others who would want the job. Zelensky would want it, but he's too close to the Banderites, and Yulia Tymoshenko would take it, but she's too despised, it would seem. So there's nobody who can really step in and do it, unless, of course, Zelensky decides to sell out his old friends, in which case he might not be too long for this world. So there's no one who can deliver the peace that the Russians want from the Ukrainian side. There's every motivation on the imperialist side to just prop up the Kiev regime and make sure that the war just keeps going on the grounds that maybe something will turn up that will move things in their favor. So in all likelihood, what this is the first round of a bunch of talks, which lead to another bunch of talks, which lead to another bunch of talks, which won't go anywhere until the Kiev regime itself either fundamentally changes or disintegrates, and the influence of the imperialists in it is lost, none of which I can see happening anytime soon. So we are essentially at the point where we have a series of talking shops between Trump and Putin, which go nowhere. The question is now, at which stage do the Russians decide that they have got what they're looking for? And if the Russians, let's conclude on this thought experiment. If the Russians militarily get all the land they want, and then say openly, right, now, Ukraine, you can have the end to this on the following conditions. Is the Ukrainian regime able to hold out against their own population when the Russians say to them, right, the war can end now, if there's no NATO, etc.? Be interesting to see what happens there. Personally, though, I think that the Kiev regime is too far gone. It can't agree to anything. It's too completely under the control of the imperialists, and therefore it will have to be fought out of existence by the Russian side. which is the reason why the Russians have that huge force in reserve. They are very well aware of the fact that they might need to do that. So that's my initial analysis of the situation. It changes almost nothing, and we will see what happens. Though I will now throw to you, good viewers and listeners, and see what questions we've got about this. Okay, let's see where we are. 505 of you watching, all good stuff. Thank you everybody for tuning in. Be sure to like and share the stream if you haven't done so already. So hello to King of Snake Island, TL Orca, Rob over there down in the Pennines. That's how I've got to address you now. DJ Darkside Jungle, Bruce Albert, Cooper Ward in the Midwest, USA, TL Orca, Rentier Oligarch, Kawa Justiniano, Francois Rabelais, A Name. We've got Spakolos, Abtin, Pavel Linovsky, Bart Vischer, Will Johnson, Community Snide Lines, TL Orca, Jenny, who's here instead of doing her job. We salute you. Sam Mullinger, Nicole, DE, and various others. So let's see where we are. Though I'm glad to see so many of you are enjoying the soundtrack. Also, hello to Albert from the Republic of Croydon. Hello to Davey, comrade in North Wales. Hello to Aziz, coming to us on a chilly morning in Sydney, Australia. Hello to Bertram in Swindon. Mercury Slim, hello to you out there in LA, the land where it is always Gavin Newsom time. President Jesus asked, would you be interested in doing a film review of the film Eddington? Heard of it, not watched it though, so I'll add it to the list. All right, duly added. Yes, Lavrov trolling by wearing a USSR sweater. Very ironic when you consider that Lavrov was a decisively anti-communist figure for quite a long time. Though, of course, his entire career was made through the old Soviet diplomatic service. So, funny how that goes. Hello to Steve Choate from Ringgold, Georgia, Mogman Dog. Abtin says, if you have solar panels in Scandinavia, you are the ultimate optimist. Pepe Escobar levels of optimism. Well, I think you have to be on Pepe's liquid diet to be that swing wildly between optimism and despair, often in the same sentence. Albert says the drunken pig Yeltsin would have grabbed the offer with both hands. Yeltsin would never have gone to war. This is the thing that we should bear in mind. It's like, as I said the other day, it's like I saw some dickhead on, of course it was Twitter, saying, oh, Putin's a Vlasovite. Well, that's not true, is it? Because the Vlasovites were, of course, the followers of General Vlasov, a former Red Army officer turned Nazi collaborator. And Vlasov was a comprador. Vlasov would have, if he'd have succeeded, helped turn the Soviet Union into a Russian puppet state that would have been enslaved by the Nazis. So Putin's not that. Whatever else he is, he and the leadership of the current system, they're not Vlasovites. In fact, there was a statue to Vlasov that was put up in the Yeltsin era, but it was torn down quite recently, I think. Yes, and yes, there were collaborator statues put up in the Yeltsin era to like people like Krasnov and others who fought on the white side, Kolchak, etc. But I think quite a number of them have been taken down quietly over the last few years. So it's not accurate to say that Putin is a comprador. It's not accurate to say he's a Vlasovite. That's nonsense. The Vlasovites were the ones who were giving away the entirety of Russia in the 1990s. Again, Putin isn't that. Putin, as I've said before, has done more to further the cause of anti-imperialism than any of the late period Soviet leaders, from like Brezhnev onward, later period Brezhnev onwards. He's done more to reverse the influence of imperialism inside Russia than any of the late period Soviet leaders. So we should bear that in mind. So calling him a Vlasovite is foolish. Yeltsin was a Vlasovite. And Yeltsin, if it was the Yeltsinites were in command, there would have been no war. A Yeltsinite-led Kremlin would have just rolled over and fucking died. We should always bear that in mind. It's also worth stating that the Russian Federation has, of course, strengthened its relationship with the DPRK up to the point where the DPRK's own news services, including their foreign news service, say that this is a stronger relationship than they ever had with the Soviet Union. So, again, these are all things that are important to bear in mind. Rentier Oligarch says, news floating around even based multipolarists of Putin giving up Zaporozhye and Kherson. That isn't correct. What he's talking about is basically keeping the line of control where it is now, so that the Zaporozhye and Kherson oblasts are essentially split in two. That was the offer that he made. And of course, knowing full well that Zelensky and his backers can't accept that. They can't accept that. They can't accept the ruling out NATO in perpetuity. They can't accept losing all that land in Donetsk. They can't accept the demilitarization. They can't accept the end of this project. The Russians know all this very well, but they're doing this diplomatic dance basically for a number of reasons, to show that they're the reasonable ones, for the purposes of, pleasing their partners in BRICS. And it is a dance, because the Putin-led government knows very well that the only reason the US is even thinking about wanting out of this is because they can't win. They can't fight the Russians themselves. They can't outproduce the Russians. They can't do anything. And so they're looking for a way out that will make it look as if they've not lost. So they're doing a dance. And I think some of the multipolarist people really need to calm the fuck down. They need to calm the fuck down and look at what's actually going on in reality and not the stuff that's in their heads. They need to get away from this idea that every tweet from some Russian official that mentions something positive about Trump or something means that there's going to be an instant capitulation. This is a game that is being played. And yes, Putin is trying his best to sow a division between the US and the Europeans. I don't think it's ultimately going to succeed at this stage, but he is doing that. And so why he mentioned to Trump, oh, Donald, terrible that thing that happened to you in 2020 with the postal voting, very insecure way of doing business. So of course he said that, because then Trump starts obsessing about that, and is less in the Russian mind, that's good for them, because it means that Trump gets angry with the CIA and the FBI, etc., and the other American intelligence services. Easy trick to do. Now, the question of is Putin going to sell out, etc.? No, I don't think that's the case. I mean, these people who keep saying sell out imminent, I mean, it's always a risk, but the fact is that the Russian leadership has reached a point where they know very well that any truce that they reach with the Americans is only going to be temporary. What they're gambling on is that the US doesn't have the capacity to refloat the Ukrainian state again, and re-engage it as or repurpose it again for its usage as a battering ram against the Russians. That they've demilitarized it to the point where it can't be used that way. So moving on, and their calculation may well be right, because the Europeans and the Americans just aren't able to produce the necessary equipment, and Ukraine doesn't have the necessary manpower. Almir says the Russian delegation rejected the scam ceasefire and came back to Moscow alive and considered the meeting a success. Yeah, the Americans wanted an immediate ceasefire. They didn't get it. The Russians turned up and said, these are the conditions, which is why and it's conditions which, of course, Trump couldn't agree to. And so that's why the meeting was cut short. And so, again, look at what he's actually done, not what he's said. There's all kinds of flannel gets said. Look at what I believe, like, he's the third or fourth ranking person, I think, in a line of presidential succession, which is, look at where Vyacheslav Volodin was, certainly no communist, said all kinds of anti-communist things. But he spent the time that Putin was in Alaska going to the state celebration put on by the DPRK to commemorate their liberation from Japanese imperialism. So, like, one of the highest ranking guys from, like, the Russian government, I think he's the leader of United Russia in the Duma, went and spoke for the Russian state at this celebration. So it shows, like, given that it led a very important and big Russian delegation there. So that's where the important stuff is happening. The dancing and the flanneling between, Putin and Trump and whatever Kirill Dmitriev is saying is all very well and good, but let's look at the reality on the ground. The reality on the ground is that the Russians are going to continue the war until the Ukrainian side cracks. That's the reality. Let's see. Rentier Oligarch says B2 is purpose-built to eliminate Russia. Yeah, well, the Russians will know damn well what it is and will have counters for it by now. Let's see what else we got here in terms of this. Mercury Slim says the meeting was a complete PR victory for Putin and co. Indeed, it was, as the American press has been obliged to accept. Yes, and Trump will get his Nobel Peace Prize. That's another thing that he's absolutely obsessed with. Right. Trump should have offered Putin McDonald's. Trump probably would have done that. Though apparently they had some snack, and that was about it. Irish Partisan says liberals have gone into meltdown comparing Alaska to Munich. It's gas that they paint Putin, Russia as Hitler and Nazi Germany when they support actual Nazis in Kiev. Oh, the irony. Yeah, well, these people aren't known for either their honesty or their accurate relationship to reality. It's all nonsense. Pavel Lenovsky says, "What do you think the Russians will complete the SMO this year, or more likely spring next year?" Depends if they go for some sort of big offensive or bigger offensive. I think they're just going to continue to go the way they are, which is just destroy as much Ukrainian men and material as possible. So this is their way of making sure that Ukraine can never be used again as a weapon, by literally killing every single man that goes to the front, or a huge number of them, or wounding them to the point where they can't be militarily used anymore. So if there's no deal, then the Russians will just have to keep pushing to the point where a collapse comes. And the question is, well, when's that? So it's more likely to be like spring of next year. And by spring of next year, there'll still be no capability by the Americans or the Europeans or the British of doing anything about it. Daniel says, seeing that GB News has been pushing the narrative that Poland is Putin's next target for some time now, my mum's Polish co-worker seems to have eaten up that lie, but she does work on a Marines base. Well, it's easy to eat that up then. I mean, what that tells you, to respond to Daniel's comment, is that the actual reality is that the British do want to get the Poles to stage some sort of provocation. That's what they would actually want. Whether they're going to get it is another question. I think exiled Poles, Poles in Britain, Poland, America, etc., would be different politically from the Poles in Poland. Poles in Poland, I don't think want much to do with this. Some of them might, but even the Ukrainians in Poland aren't queuing up to go back and fight. So I don't think this is going to be successful if that's their aim. But the fact that GB News, this was a ridiculous propaganda channel, as ridiculous as the BBC in many ways, is pushing that means that someone in the Ministry of Defense is pushing that. The idea of, oh, it's Poland next. Well, it'd only be Poland next if Poland staged some kind of provocation against the Russians. And the people pushing for that are in London. Right. Bone Adelsex or whatever says the Industrial Revolution, its consequences have been disaster for the human race. Incorrect. They have greatly increased the life expectancy of those who live in advanced countries, but they have destabilized society, have made life unfulfilling, have subjected human beings to indignities, have led to widespread psychological suffering in the third world and physical suffering as well, and have inflicted severe damage on the natural world. This is all nonsense. How fulfilling was the life of a English peasant in the 13th century? It wasn't very fulfilling, trust me. Like this is primitivist garbage. This is like a common thing because capitalism is degenerating in the West and going downhill. Like, well, look at what the people in the revolutionary countries of the developing post-colonial world or neo-colonial world say. Look at what like the Venezuelans want. Look at what the Burkinabes want, the Malians want, the Nigerians want. They want a modern industrialized society. They want the full modernization of their societies. That's what every anti-colonial liberation movement has wanted. They want to industrialize their countries and modernize their countries to the point where they can have real sovereignty and independence and to actually overcome the damage done to them by colonialism. And by the way, this idea, this image of a sort of pastoral history where the society was well balanced and everybody was living a life of bucolic happiness. This is nonsense. Capitalism is incredibly cruel and comes into the world, as Marx observed, covered from head to toe in blood. But in actual fact, it leads directly to a development of the possibilities of vastly enhancing human life due to a huge improvement in science and technology that comes through or is made available via the capitalist development of new means of production. But it takes, of course, communism to fully realize that potential. But capitalism opens the path, and then communism basically makes the road that will lead us to the future, a future where the human race is immeasurably better off, and leads immeasurably longer and better lives, and becomes more truly human. For a while, yes, there are horrors done by capitalism, but that's why the next logical step is the overthrow of capitalism and the coming of socialism. But that's made available to us via the development of capitalism. No one said that this progress would be particularly pleasant. Marx was very clear on that. You get a development of huge potential via the capitalist production methods. That involves a lot of suffering, a lot of horror. That's why socialism is a necessity. To fully realize the potential lies within the capitalist development of the means of production. So I don't agree with you. I think this is primitivist nonsense. Let's go through, see if there's any. Be sure to like and share the stream if you haven't done so already. DJ Darkside says NATO is gone after this war and the EU isn't going to be far behind it. This is another factor in the Russian calculation, which if NATO is seen to have been unable to win this war with everything they chucked at it, then it will fundamentally discredit both NATO and the EU. The EU may well not belong for this world anyway, with the coming greater economic disaster that is looming on the horizon. May well be that the EU ends up fucked, like Caligula's favorite watermelon. But NATO will be fundamentally damaged by even a settlement on the moderate terms that Putin outlined will hugely damage NATO, hugely damage it. No one will. It's already more and more populations in the east of Europe don't want anything to do with NATO. There's like the Bulgarians didn't really want to join NATO, like the Montenegrins didn't want it. As we read the reporting of my comrade and friend Kit Klarenberg on that, loads of the former Yugoslav populations didn't want it, and they're going to want it even less now. Because look what the NATO membership gave to Ukraine, an absolute horror, a slaughterhouse. So who wants that? Because it doesn't provide security. And if the war is ended and NATO membership is taken off the table for Ukraine, then it shows that NATO membership is worth fundamentally nothing. Because Ukraine was in NATO in all but name. As was said early on in 2022, if Ukraine was used, like they were never actually meant to join NATO. It was meant to be dangled in front of them to control them. But fundamentally, NATO tried everything it could possibly realistically do, other than marching an army into Ukraine, which would have been fucking wiped out anyway. NATO is going to be extremely badly discredited by this. And it might not survive the next few years when the peace finally arrives. So that's another reason why the NATO structure isn't going to want an end to the war. They're not going to want an end to the war because that would mean basically that the question mark then is stamped over NATO, over when does this thing end? Because if it can be turned around now by force, and all that it could do was essentially create a lot of Ukrainian casualties, but it couldn't stop the Russians, that might be enough to end it, or at least to severely damage it. President Jesus says Trump zoned out after 5 minutes of the meeting with Putin. Well, I bet he did. Putin probably just mentioned to him about 2020, and then Trump just thought about, it was rigged. It was rigged against me. It was terrible. Awful. Russia, Russia, Russia. Scandal, scandal. Terrible. Oh, that Obama guy. Terrible guy. Did I tell you he's probably one of those type of guys? Trump has the concentration level of a 5-year-old child who's taken too many E numbers, like useless. But then again, look at how the last guy was. TL Orca says Alaska goes back to Russia 2030. That'd be something. Evening to holistic politics in the occupied nation of Finland. Perhaps DE says perhaps they'll get Sean Penn to be puppet president of Ukraine for a while. Well, he'd take the role and the habits as well. Hello to Alan from Oakland. Where are we now? What are your thoughts on Russia going deep into Dnipropetrovsk and Sumy? Well, they'll continue to advance up there as long as the NATO side refuses any kind of agreement. They'll continue to slowly advance. I mean, we will see basically. If the more that the Ukrainian forces collapse, the more the Russians will have the opportunity to take more land. Initially, that will be treated as a bargaining chip. But if the Ukraine side absolutely refuses, or the NATO side, I should say, absolutely refuses any settlement whatsoever, then they'll be obliged to just keep taking more, because that's the way these things. That's the way that this will have to work out, you know, because the whole question of land is something that the Russians have always been. That's been always been their most moderate demand, because they don't want huge amounts of Ukrainian territory. They've been obliged to take it. Just as the longer the war goes on, they'll take it. It's what to take more. to push the Ukrainian regime to, they hope, some kind of peace arrangement. The British and the others know this very well. They know that the Ukrainian regime can't give up, can't appear to capitulate, can't offer concessions. So the reason why the British are so keen on keeping the war going is because they think that if they can make the Russians occupy more land, that gives more opportunity for terrorist actions. The Russians are very well aware of this, which is part of the reason why they don't want land or don't want too much land. So you have a strange situation where, in my view, like certain characters in London would rather that the Russians occupied more land, and there are many in Moscow who don't actually want to do that. They might be obliged to do that because if the British get their way, they will have to push it all the way to the point where the Kiev regime collapses, and that will probably mean having to take Kiev itself. That's something the Russians don't want to do, but it might be something they have to do ultimately, depending upon if the Kiev regime can be pushed to capitulation. Now, where are we? Holistic Politics said, I was surprised to see Grover Fair on a YouTube podcast, which I considered right-wing, giving an interview on anti-Stalin paradigm in the West. Fair's work seemed meticulous, according to the testimony he gave. Well, Fair's an interesting one because what he says in Khrushchev Lied and a lot of other work, he's like, it's not that he makes extravagant claims. He didn't do the Stalin did nothing wrong meme or anything like that, even though that's true. What he says is that Khrushchev had no evidence for the claims that he made, or wildly exaggerated the claims that he made, or straight up lied about the claim in terms of the claims he was making. And then he does the same thing with like Stephen Kotkin and people like that, which is that he follows their footnotes through. He goes through their footnotes and he finds that the evidence they cite ultimately traces back to like a fascist newsletter from Ukraine in 1937 or something. So what he finds is that, in actual fact, people like Kotkin, Conquest, and others, their so-called scholarship is very shaky and very shoddy. And so Fair is quite cautious in his claims. What he basically says is that if you write a bunch of anti-Stalin shit, then you'll get published in the West because the anti-Stalin paradigm has been the only paradigm permissible for 80 years. But what impressed me was the caution in his books, in that he doesn't make grandiose claims. He goes by the evidence, and he'll say, well, there's no evidence of this. And what he always says is that the evidence of absence absence of evidence is not evidence of absence, meaning that the wild claims about Stalin are quite simply like made up, a lot of them, because there's never any evidence of them, and no evidence has been released from the old Soviet archive, even in the 90s, when they had every reason to release anti-Stalin stuff. And so all the anti-Stalin stuff that is out there is often like wild nonsense, and you can tell it's wild nonsense because you do what Fair does, which is just try and track down what the evidence actually is, and there's often none there, or it's something that some fucking clownish fascist made up. Pavel says, the comrades of the Communistisch organization agree with your analysis in regards to German imperialism's aims. I don't agree with them that Germany will be able to reindustrialize for war. I think that German imperialism has aims against Russia which are unacknowledged by many so-called multipolarists who still harbor the deluded fantasy that Germany and Russia can be great partners together. Nonsense. Germany is an imperialist power. The German ruling class has sought the destruction of the current Russian system of government as enthusiastically as the French and the British and the Americans have. So the idea that Merz or anybody's going to, sign some sort of peace treaty is nonsense. They require the destruction and subjugation of Russia just as much as anybody else does, just as much as the other imperialists do. However, on the question of would they be able to reindustrialize for war, my instinct is at the moment no. doesn't look like they'll be able to do it, certainly not under the clownish leadership of Friedrich Merz. But German imperialism is still dangerous, and that people lack an understanding of the fact that it is an imperialist power, even if it's one that plays a subordinated role to the Americans. It's a reason why Germany is often misunderstood. Caustic Grip says, Yeltsin wanted to give away everything. I think I remember Nemtsov saying that he was on his knees in front of drunk Yeltsin, asking him not to give away the Kuril Islands. Yeah. Yeltsin would have given away Moscow itself if Napoleon had shown up again. Helene Matt says, Putin doesn't represent the working class. He represents the oligarchs, or his oligarchs, and longs for being part of the West. Putin hates communism and uses its symbols as populist nationalism. I would say there's a lot of inaccuracies there. I think the Putin of 25 years ago, as he has admitted himself, wanted to be part of the West. Yeah, he did. And he got kicked in the bollocks for it. As he, again, has admitted in reflections that he has engaged in. Like, they wanted to be part of the West, and the West fucked them off. And so now, like, you see interviews with Putin, even with Western journalists, and he talks about how he was fooled, how the West's policy never changes. They know all this now. So this is the interesting thing. And so I'd say, Helene, you're wrong. Yes, he doesn't represent the working class, but he is far more of an anti-imperialist now, regardless of what his original intentions were, than the late period Soviet elite leaders. And the fact that they've had to go back to using the symbols of communism, or the symbols of what I would call the socialist era, tells you just how empty bourgeois Russian nationalism is in terms of being able to rally the masses. Do I see the Trump regime, Mrs. King of Snake Island, discontinuing support to the war effort by stopping weapons supply and intelligence? Interesting one. They don't have many more weapons to give. Do they? Would they cut off intelligence sharing? Not at this stage, I don't think. Not when they still think they can bargain with the Russians. At a certain stage, they might. I can't see it happening for now, though. I think Trump is the very last person I would expect to do that, because Trump doesn't have the level of political skill or concentration level to be able to tell U.S. intelligence to stop sharing intelligence with the Ukrainians. Now, it may be the case that Trump says, start giving them stuff. And the CIA goes, and the Defense Intelligence Agency and others go, okay, Mr. President. So they then just pass the stuff to the British, who then pass it to the Ukrainians. So the most you'll ever get is fucking cartoonish sort of circus act, really, which is where they pretend not to be sharing stuff, but they, in all practicality, are. I just can't see them making that kind of concession publicly, and I can't see Trump being able to force it, to be honest. Cooper Ward says, be honest, Alex, Trump messed up big time by not offering Putin his typical platter of McDonald's. Would have ended the operation immediately. Maybe so, or maybe Putin it would better watch what he eats if he's in the United States. Ozcan below Akanash says, if China attempts to take over Taiwan, what is the American NATO plan for the war? I don't see how they could accomplish anything against a country like that. They don't have a plan. They don't have a plan. Well, the plan seems to be to make the Taiwanese or the Filipinos or the Japanese fight the war for them. And the Chinese know that. And the Chinese know that they could severely damage any American force that is sent. The Americans don't have the men to withstand a full-blown Chinese assault on Taiwan, but I don't think the Chinese are going to do that. They're going to play a waiting game. And they think that the US is finished even in the short to medium term, and won't be able to do anything to prop up Taiwan for much longer. And so all they need to do is to wait out the Americans And then when the American system starts falling to pieces, the Taiwanese regime will go into a crisis because it won't have a patron anymore. And the Chinese can negotiate a peaceful reunification, which is what the Chinese leadership's always wanted. King of Snake Island says, how long will the West be able to support the war effort if it continues as is? Not very long. Not very long. I don't think they would be able to keep the Ukrainians supplied much longer, particularly if there's a larger scale Russian assault. They're already struggling to supply so many different armored vehicles, shells, etc. They've run out of stuff to send. They're only sending like dribs and drabs now. So not very long. I mean, we're talking maybe to the end of the year, maybe not even that. Do you see Trump slapping secondary sanctions on India and China and BRICS? What will be the collective reaction? Well, they're going to try and avoid slapping sanctions on China because China can seriously damage the US. If China cuts off further, like supply of rare earth metals or various other things that the US needs for its arms industry, then that's going to do a severe amount of damage. So the US can't afford to fuck around with China. That's the thing. They can't afford to do this like stuff with the tariffs and like the threatening more and more sanctions, because the Chinese have ways of hurting the Americans. The Indians less so, but the Indians have made an awful lot of money trading in Russian oil, so why would they want to stop now? Yes, the US has more leverage over India than it does over China. They can't do much to China. That's the truth, which is what Trump's discovered. There's very little he can actually do, or any American president could do to the Chinese, given that the Chinese policy is for greater self-reliance and developing their internal market, rather than just be making money flogging stuff to the US and Europe. They want to develop their own internal systems now, boost domestic consumption. So that leaves the US with very little leverage to use. So yes, they might try them on India, but it's not going to do much to stop the Russians now. Paul says, I see the rebellion of the Donbass working class against the fascists as the beginning of the fight back of the world's masses on the road to a socialist world. I completely agree with Paul's analysis there. Gil Jones says, I don't listen to any of the multipolarists. I do some of them. Someone like Glenn Deason is a more interesting figure because he's a bit more honest in his analysis, even if I don't agree with him. I don't think he's making shit up or doing a Pepe Escobar. But many of the rest of them, just useless. Is there any realistic possibility of a collective security agreement, military alliance between Russia, China, North Korea, and Iran? Well, there already is one between North Korea, DPRK, and Russia, as we saw by the DPRK sending soldiers to fight in Kursk. Russia and China have agreements over a whole range of areas, but not a formal military one. There's no formal military one that exists between Russia or China and Iran either. China has made it clear they're not abandoning Iran and will continue to supply them with all kinds of things, including apparently weaponry. The Russians are supplying them with weaponry. So if China doesn't abandon Iran in the case of a renewed US assault and continues to supply them, then there's very, very little the US can do to change that. And the Chinese have realized that it's in their interests to back up the Iranians. It's better to have the Islamic Republic there than whatever nightmare the US would create. Right, okay, so 678 of you watching so far. Thanks to everybody who's tuned in. Right, I'm going to have to bring things to a close for the moment. So thanks to all 710 of you who've tuned in. That's very good stuff. Right, so future plans. I'll be back again with you tomorrow evening, probably from 7 p.m. this time. So be sure to join me again for that one. Keep an eye out for more Decline and Fall episodes next week. Thanks to everybody who supports the show on Patreon and Buy Me a Coffee. Couldn't do the show without your support. As I said, I'll be back again with you tomorrow. But until then, here's some outro for you.
Небо утреннего стяг, в жизни важен первый шаг. Слышишь, реют над страною ветры яростных атак. И вновь продолжает собой, и сердцу тревожно в груди. И Ленин такой молодой, и юный октябрь впереди. И Ленин такой молодой, и юный октябрь впереди. Весть летит во все концы, вы поверьте нам, отцы, будут новые победы, станут новые бойцы. Милости не жди, жизнь для правды не щади. Нам, ребята, в этой жизни только с правдой по пути. И